Welcome to 28storms.com. This is your tropical weather update for Saturday, August 20th. The latest graphical tropical weather outlook from the National Hurricane Center indicates that Tropical Storm Harvey is moving into Belize as a strong tropical storm. It didn't quite make it to hurricane status, which is certainly good news. But more importantly, now we have 97L Invest being given a 90% chance of development within the next 48 hours, and it could happen as early as this afternoon. We have a reconnaissance plane flying through the system to determine if it has already developed a closed surface circulation, and in that case they would make this a tropical depression. And finally, we also have this tropical wave off the coast of Africa. The chances of development have been decreased now to 30%, and either way it looks like this will definitely recurve, so we're not too worried about that one. The regional water vapor imagery shows that Tropical Storm Harvey is pushing its way inland, so the main threat will be heavy rainfall and flooding, especially in areas of higher terrain, but this is no threat to interest in the Gulf of Mexico as it will continue westward even to the south of the Bay of Campeche. Now if we turn to the central Atlantic, we see that our tropical wave is definitely flaring a lot more than yesterday, and it's also beginning to take up a lot more area, and that's a sign that the upper level environment, including that upper level ridge that was more toward the east yesterday, is continuing to spread westbound with the tropical wave. And also this tropical wave, tropical upper tropospheric trough that was to the northwest of our wave is also beginning to get shunted back toward the west. So the environment is steadily becoming more favorable as the models had suggested, and the main inhibiting factor over the next 3 to 5 days will be land interaction with some of the bigger islands of the Greater Antilles, and we're going to talk about how much this is going to impact the forecast, especially if this gets close to Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, and Cuba, as we are currently thinking. Now, these are the most recent 18Z tropical model plots, and first off, these models and their accuracy are greatly dependent on whether or not they are initialized in the correct position. Now, the models are initialized by the Hurricane Center, but we still don't have a complete closed surface center yet, so this could still develop either here or just a little bit toward the north or toward the south, and that would have significant consequences with regard to the forecast track. But as of right now, the model consensus does take this directly over Hispaniola, or at least the tropical model consensus does, and then eventually it spreads on into eastern Cuba and then turns northwest directly into the Florida Peninsula. Now, certainly we do not want our friends to see the full brunt of this tropical system in the Caribbean, but this would be one of the better or more favorable tracks for interest in the United States, as more land interaction over the Caribbean would guarantee that this storm would be at least kept in check to some extent and would not significantly intensify before it begins to make landfall in the southeast United States. In the meantime, we are still trying to figure out where that primary circulation is going to form. As of 3:45 p.m. Eastern Time, the hurricane hunters are still flying through the system to determine if they can find a closed surface circulation, but at this time they haven't quite found one. So using the most recent visible satellite imagery, we can see that we still have a mid-level circulation gaining quite a lot of latitude now. It's between 16 and 17 degrees north latitude, but the primary low-level banding is still located well to the south and west. Now, over the next 24 hours, it is fairly likely that both of these circulations will eventually come together, and that is when we will begin to see more steady strengthening into a tropical depression or tropical storm. But exactly where that happens is still somewhat unknown. On the latest infrared, we can see that convection is beginning to diminish to some extent near the original location of the mid-level circulation, although we now have a new flare-up beginning between 15 and 16 degrees north latitude, so this could be the next localized area to keep a close watch on as this begins to head off toward the Lesser Antilles in the general direction of Martinique. Now, if we begin to take a look at some of the latest 12Z Dynamical model guidance, we will notice there are some significant discrepancies between the model members. Starting off with the 12Z CMC model, we see that this particular model thinks that the primary circulation will develop along to the southwest of all that primary convection, and therefore it takes it on a more southerly track closer toward Jamaica rather than Hispaniola and the eastern half of Cuba, and then eventually this still takes it into the southeast Gulf of Mexico. And then the second major difference is that we see the shortwave trough is expected to be over the Arklatex. Now, all of the other model members are a bit further toward the east with that little weakness over the southeast United States, and I'll let this loop one more time. We see that the primary trough or the long wave begins to lift out, but it leaves a little piece behind here, and it starts to drip back toward the southwest underneath a second area of ridging over the south central United States. So Both this more southerly motion, or a southerly track over the Caribbean, combined with a more westerly weakness in the trough over the Gulf Coast states, would guarantee that this will take a more northwest track in the southeast Gulf of Mexico rather than going directly up the Florida Peninsula. Now we're going to switch over to the 12Z UK Met forecast. This is the 24-hour forecast of the sea level pressure overlaid with the 500 millibar height field. This is our developing tropical cyclone, now located just to the west of the Lesser Antilles at this time. We still have a lot of ridging over the southwest Atlantic, but notice by 48 hours we see that long wave trough dipping into the western Atlantic out of Canada. By day 3, we see that the trough is still there, but now beginning to start lifting out a little bit, and by day 4, the main trough has already lifted out. And also notice, much like the Canadian CMC, the UK Met is still taking this a bit more toward the west, at least in the short to medium range, over much of the eastern and central Caribbean. This would be a problematic track, not only because it would guarantee that this gets more so into the southeast Gulf of Mexico, but it would also imply that it will have more time to develop into a significant hurricane to the south of Cuba. If we advance this into the day 5 range, we see that, much like the Canadian CMC, we still have a weakness here over the southeast Gulf of Mexico. The ridging over the western Atlantic is beginning to build back toward the west, and we have a major hurricane now sitting near the western tip of Cuba. We are now looking at the 12Z GFS 500 millibar forecast, and you can start to make out the beginnings of our tropical cyclone here. It's actually picking up more so on that mid-level circulation initially by the looks of it, and as we go into the 24-hour time frame, that is definitely the main feature that the model wants to develop, and therefore it takes it a little bit more toward the north, closer to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. But still, we have that mid-level ridge over much of the central and western Atlantic initially, so as we go from 24 to 48 hours, notice that we still see more of a westerly track than anything, which would guarantee that this stays just to the south of the highest terrain of Hispaniola. And by 72 to 84 hours, we notice that the storm is expected to be between Haiti and the eastern tip of Cuba. The primary long wave trough is beginning to lift out, but notice we still have a bit of a weakness here across southern Florida and the Bahamas, and that is the main difference between the CMC and the UK Met models compared to the GFS, because as we see, the model begins to take this a little bit more toward the north as we go into early on Thursday into Thursday afternoon. We begin to see that the storm is moving into the Florida Keys and the Miami Metro. And by this point, the model has the storm being caught in this weakness, so therefore it parallels much of the Florida Peninsula before turning more into Georgia and the Carolinas down the road. So what we just looked at was the 12Z GFS operational model, but let's see if its Ensemble members agree with the operational forecast. So starting off at 24 hours, our system is once again expected to be just to the west of the Lesser Antilles. We're going to steadily advance this throughout the period. Much like the operational GFS, it's keeping the tropical cyclone just to the south of Hispaniola, which again is problematic because this is more than likely going to become at least a hurricane while still in the Caribbean, as long as it can avoid some of the greater landmasses of the Greater Antilles. So here we go into 96 hours. There's the tropical cyclone between Hispaniola and eastern Cuba, much like the operational was dictating. And here is the long wave trough still over much of the eastern United States. But here is the difference. Once we get closer to around day 5, we see that the ridge over the western Atlantic quickly builds back toward the west. And although our tropical system is beginning to gain more latitude, it's gaining latitude a bit more to the west of what the operational GFS was indicating. Now the ensembles are still implying a hurricane threat to the Florida Keys, but as we go into day 5 and especially day 6 and day 7, notice that the position of the tropical cyclone is a bit more into the southeast Gulf of Mexico and eventually into the Florida Panhandle. So initially it would appear that the 12Z GFS operational was just a little bit too far north in the medium range, but here we go with the 12Z European coming out, and keep in mind the European is typically our best dynamical model. And as we go into 24 and 48 hours, look, it's also developing that mid-level circulation. So naturally, the storm is beginning to develop at a higher latitude compared to what the CMC and UK Met were showing. And therefore, by 48 and 72 hours, that suggests a greater threat to a direct landfall for Hispaniola. And by 96 hours, you would think that the storm isn't quite that intense by going directly over Hispaniola, but somehow within the 72 and 96 hour time frame, the European is still developing this into what would appear to be a minimal hurricane. And then by day 5, the ridge is building back over the western Atlantic, but the hurricane is still at a high enough latitude initially to still feel the remnant weakness over the Bahamas and southern Florida. And so then by day 6, the storm is moving up the eastern coast of Florida, and believe it or not, by day 7, it's taking a run toward Georgia and South Carolina. So once again, more important than anything will be determining exactly where this surface circulation initially forms, because that could have great ramifications as to what occurs in the future. And if we take a quick look at what the reconnaissance plane has found so far, there are no signs that the circulation is closed just yet, but the best evidence of a developing circulation is around near 14 degrees north and 57 degrees west, as denoted by some of the southeast winds to the east of the possible circulation, and then off just toward the west we see some northeasterly winds here. So keep this in mind, 14 degrees north, 57 degrees west. So if we go back and look for those coordinates on the most recent satellite imagery, that is where some of the most recent convection is beginning to form here. So this is the main feature to watch, and I think more important than anything, or what the best thing to do, is going to be to take a blend between the Canadian CMC and the UK Met forecast, which again, those are the more southerly tracks, and then take a blend between those and the more northerly tracks of the GFS and European. And so when you put all of this together, the biggest threat for the United States appears to be for the Florida Peninsula. However, as we've seen, there are still quite a lot of models taking this into the southeast Gulf. So all interest in the eastern Gulf of Mexico, and even up the east coast to some extent into Georgia and the Carolinas, should still be keeping a close watch on this storm until we can really sort through this over the next 24 to 48 hours. And just to reiterate the potential here, this could easily be a major hurricane threat to portions of the southeast United States, but that is greatly dependent on what type of track this takes while over the Caribbean. If it goes directly over Hispaniola and eastern Cuba, we could still see a hurricane landfall out of this in the United States, but that would somewhat diminish the chances of this ever becoming a major hurricane. But that is something we cannot really specify at this current point in time, so stick with us here at 28storms.com. We will have more updates on our website and on our Facebook pages throughout the afternoon and evening hours, and expect another video here no later than tomorrow. So thanks again for stopping by, and have a good afternoon.